Okay. I think that would be a little more comfortable. All right. I have 3, right? You guys have 3 o'clock?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because I know some other people said they were going to hook on, but you never know, things occur. So what we had basically concluded at the end of last week's class, we finished the time period of the Balei Tosfos. And it's interesting when you talk about, Rashi and his commentary, whether Chumash, of course, and also the Gemara, it's him. He is the person writing it. Talk about Balei Tosfos, so you're talking about, a much larger number of Rabbanim who are all contributing their works. And it was, it's from primarily the 12th and 13th centuries, France and Germany. So all the Rabbanim, again, when you talk about Balei Tosfos, that's where they are. They're the Jews of Ashkenaz. Now we're going to be starting. I began a little bit last week, but I'll repeat so it flows better. Now we're going to see what's happening now with the Jews of Spain in the 12th century. So it's interesting. They talk about the golden age of Spain, and they say that goes approximately from the year 900 to 1200. But we're going to see that in that 12th century, there are going to be some very great and famous Rabbanim, poets, philosophers, of course, from that time period. And it's going to be a radical change in the political landscape. And things are actually going to start getting very difficult for the Jews. And obviously I'm focusing now on Muslim Spain. But later on, when we talk about going into more 13th, 14th century, then we'll talk about some possible scholars, in northern Christian Spain. But up until now, whatever we've studied from Spain, we're always talking about those Jews living in Muslim Spain, which is, until the Reconquista, conquers more and more territory. It's basically central and southern Spain. Okay, that's Muslim Spain. And I'll just show you, I have my map, but I'll show you later, when we get to certain particular towns or cities that different individuals came from. So again, when the Spain is conquered by the Muslims in the 700s, all right, and gradually though the Jews, will gain in importance there, contributed. There will be influenced by the Muslim world, stress on language. So many great poets come from this time period, and also philosophy. Those are two of the key influences from that Muslim Spanish era. Now, by and large, up until that 12th century, life is basically very stable. Muslim Spain was quite tolerant towards the Jews in its midst. But you're going to see, starting even in that 12th century, so when you say 12th century, that means we're talking about from the year 1100 to the year 1200. There's going to be a major shift in how Muslim Spain will act towards its Jews, even though it is still going to be a century of great flowering of intellect and culture, on the part of the Jews living there. So again, up until, we're talking about into the 11th century, so there's a caliphate that is ruling over Spain, and that's the Abbasid Caliphate. But I had explained at the very end of the last, week's lecture that the Arabs, right, who obviously led that original invasion, made Spain Muslim, that they were held the key positions of leadership. But how were they able to conquer? They actually needed the help of the Berbers, and the Berbers are Moroccan. And at a certain point in time, these Berbers, were getting very frustrated with the Arab rule, the fact that they were taking all the key positions for themselves. And so they are going to rebel against them. And that starts already in the year 1012. So we're still talking about 11th century. And at that point, so that's southern Spanish area, is actually going to be broken up now into 23 small city states. So it's going to be somewhat fragmented. Eventually, though, by the time we get to the year 1066, just bear in mind, what's 1066? Would be that date. That's always the time when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel, from France and conquers England, right? And now he becomes the ruler of England. But at that same time period, in Spain, what's happening the exact same year, 1066, those Arabs who were discontented, with what was going on, plus the Berbers, obviously, who still want to gain more control, they're going to rebel against the ruling Muslim king at that time period. And it's at that juncture, right? So now we're talking about a little bit past post 11th century Spain. The Jews actually in Cordova, because one of the key individuals who was aligned with the current king had sided with him, and so a lot of this anger that's coming forth from these rebellious, Arabs who also didn't like that king, and the Berbers, they now attack the Jews, and 4,000 Jews were actually killed in that area around Cordova. And who was the leading Jewish, personality, at that juncture? And his name was Yosef. He was the son of Shmuel HaNagid. And Shmuel HaNagid was greatly respected, but his son was not as well liked. Shmuel HaNagid has already passed on. His son has now taken on the mantle of, as advisor to the king. And then there is going to be attack now upon the Jews of Cordova, and among 4,000 of them will actually lose their lives. Now, it's only going to get progressively worse. So it's interesting. So even though we always think in general terms, that life was good for the Jews under Muslim rule, that's not only up until a certain point, and then it changes, all right? And of course, those things will be even worse under, Christian rule as they consolidate their power. But, don't think that things were so fabulous even under Muslim rule. So I'm going to start now from after that time period. So now I'm in the year 1086. And now there's going to be a Berber dynasty that's going to rise to power in Morocco. They're going to cross around that area around Gibraltar and enter Spain. Okay, and they're called the Almoravids. Okay. So first, as I say, they have consolidated their power in Morocco, but now they're going to go after southern Spain as well. And now it's going to be total chaos now for the Jews living there. There's a period now of enmity, open enmity, and they're going to persecute the Jews in their midst. Now, the head is called Emir, E-M-I-R. So Emir Yusuf, he wasn't even himself such a Gracer Muslim, but he was persuaded, obviously, by a lot of his followers that, how are we going to deal with the Jews who live, in our midst? So either they're going to have a wonderful choice. Either they can convert to Islam or they can go into exile. Well, you can imagine how the Jewish community reacted to this. It was terrible for them. So, money talks. So they collected a huge bribe, which they presented to the emir. And then he said, all right, fine, you can stay here. But already you could see times are getting troubled. They're not living there in the great peace and security that they had been, up until this time period. And things are really going to get only worse as time goes on. But they had to continue paying these bribes, right, to curry favor, with the emir. And that was the only way they could guarantee their safe status. But with all this going on, with the payment of the heavy bribes, there are still going to be periodic attacks upon the Jews. And gradually, a certain portion of the Jews living in Muslim Spain will decide that they've had enough, and they're going to move northward to Christian Spain, which almost seems ironic now when when we bear in mind what's going to happen later on and how life will be so utterly horrible for them living, in under Christian rule. But for now, things are peaceful. In Christian Spain, they're not attacking their Jews at all. So, to escape from this burden of periodic attacks upon them, having to pay these huge bribes to the Muslim, ruler, they're now going to gradually, I'm saying it's not a mass movement, but some people are gradually going to leave and go to northern Spain. Now, these Almoravids, they remained in power until the year 1149. So we're talking about, just like 65 years they were in control. Now it's going to get even worse. Okay, now the names are very similar, so it's a little confusing. So I always think so Almoravids are the first, Berber people to come and conquer southern Muslim Spain. And the next group that's going to come in will be even worse are the Almohads. Okay, so first is Almoravids, and now these are Almohads. They're also, as they say, a Moorish dynasty, and Moors and Berbers, are interchangeable. All right, they come from Morocco. And bear in mind, there are Jews living in Morocco. That North African region was conquered by the Arabs prior to their even crossing the Straits of Gibraltar and going into Spain. So things are not good for the Jews in Morocco at this point either, obviously, living under, these more fanatic Muslims. And again, the Jews are given the choice, you want to convert, fine, or else emigrate. Get out of here. And many Jews will flee at this point, and a very key person, who haven't come to me yet, but is part of that group, all right, with his family. Let's see, and this happens for 100 years. It lasts like this, very terrible conditions there. And so gradually, their power is also going to wane, all right? So it's a very unfortunate situation now for these Jews who had for a few centuries had lived in great peace. They were very prosperous. They felt very secure in their lives in Muslim Spain. But, as soon as the fanatics came in, things changed tremendously for those Jews. It's also, we'll be discussing this a little later on. We'll talk about certain key Rabbanim from the era. So for many of these Spanish Jews, what kind of choice is this? Stay here or convert to Islam, or get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. So quite a number of them, which is very unlike the Jews of Ashkenaz, that outwardly converted to Islam, but privately, within their homes, they will practice Judaism. So when we talk at a much later time period, we talk about the conversos, or the negative term is Marranos. This was already a mindset of Spanish Jewry for a few hundred years. Because we're talking about, starting already in the late 1000s, 1100s. And we're not talking about till 1492. You think of the expulsion of all the Jews from all of. So it was in their mindset that it is acceptable, that it is okay to outwardly convert to a foreign religion, to become Muslim, but secretly within your home to practice Judaism. Now, they didn't seek them out like they will under the Inquisition and drag them out and burn them at the stake of the face, and maybe some of them even knew these Jews were secretly adhering to their old faith, but it was okay, fine. Just present yourselves as, faithful Muslims, and you can stay in the land. Obviously, still some people were very uncomfortable with this lifestyle, and they did leave. But again, when we had talked earlier, and don't forget those Jews of Ashkenaz, France and Germany, they lived under most terrible conditions, and the Crusaders passing through them and were murdering them. And they too had an option to convert, and by and large, they did not. And they were willing to give up their lives, al Kiddush Hashem. So just two very different reactions to persecution. But among the Jews of Ashkenaz, and obviously their leaders, the Rabbanim, it was like an anathema to even outwardly profess your loyalty, let's say in that case, to Christianity and to try to live secretly as Jews. But in this Spanish Jewish community, this will become a very acceptable practice. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a few key individuals who are living at this time period in Spain. You may be familiar with some of the names and some not, but for the Jews of that time, these were quite prominent individuals. So amazingly, as even when I think about those Jews of Ashkenaz and those terrible crusades and all those terrible false accusations, again, the blood libels, the host desecration, these horrible things. But they continued to live their Jewish lives. It's incredible. So too here in Spain, even with this Muslim oppression, there's still going to be a great flourishing of Jewish scholarship, which is really amazing. And they will continue to transfer whatever knowledge they had gained from the Gaonic period, bringing it now into at that point, their more modern age. All right. The greatest man of learning in Jewish Spain at the beginning of the 12th century, again, we're talking about 1100s, okay? His name was Rabbi Yosef Levi Ibn Megash, so he's known as Ibn Megash. He lived from the years 1077 to 1141. Apparently, he was this brilliant child prodigy, and he traveled to Lucena. So I'm just going to show you. I hope if you can see my map. Okay, so Cordova is a little bit to the north, and Lucena is slightly to the south of it. Okay, so we're still talking about Andalusia, the southern region of Spain. Okay. And he went there to study when he was 12 years old. And there he's learning under Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who is the Rif, very famous. He has that name because he came from Fez, Morocco, where he grew up and actually grew to manhood there and became a well-known Rav. Then with persecution there, he fled to Spain. Of course, at his time period, it was more secure. And so this Ibn Megash, learns under the Rif now for 14 years until the Rif passes away. And that was in the year 1103. So we're already under those Almoravids. But remember, you're paying the bribe, so it's okay. You can stay, So things were not so wonderful for the Jews, but a certain measure of stability, okay? And apparently the Rif was so impressed, this child prodigy, that he actually appointed him to be his successor and head of his yeshiva, even though he had a son of his own who I'm sure was a scholar as well. But this Ibn Megash really impressed him, so he made him head of the yeshiva. So under the leadership of Ibn Megash, the yeshiva Lucena just continues to grow and apparently attracted hundreds of students. And one of the foremost one of those was a Rabbi Maimon ben Yosef, who was the father of the Rambam, because Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Okay, so just trying to put everything into sort of chronological perspective. So think the Rif, then Ibn Megash, then Rabbi Maimon, and ultimately we'll come to the Rambam. Rabbi Maimon apparently lived from 1092 to 1168. Now, the Ibn Megash apparently had a great output of Talmudic writings, and he wrote apparently extensive commentaries on the tractates of Bava Basra and Shavuos. And apparently a lot of his writings were preserved in the works of his students and his students' students. So I don't know if anybody studies Ibn Megash, but I guess somehow it has come down through us, and I guess somebody who's really a scholar in Talmudic studies, would study some of Ibn Megash's writings. Apparently, he was the undisputed leader during that generation. And actually, we're now coming to like the zenith of that golden age, all right? Because that's what it's going to end for sure by the year 1200. It was his Torah greatness that propelled Spanish Jewry to even greater accomplishments. So this great creativity, this vitality, which takes place now between the 12th and the 14th century, it's all can be traced back, right, to this intensification of Torah study and Talmudic tradition that was inspired by right, the teachings and the writings of Ibn Magash. So bear his name in mind, even though he may not be familiar to you, because he's going to play a key role with the most brilliant Spanish Jewish scholar, right, of this 12th century. Now, I want to digress and also talk, before we come to the Rambam, talk about a few other key individuals from this time period and whose writings have come down to us through the ages. Okay, and one is Rabbi Moshe ibn Ezra. Now, we're going to learn also about an Avraham ibn Ezra. It's Avraham ibn Ezra, who was the Ibn Ezra that you'll find in a Mikros Gadol, is one of the commentaries of the Torah, and that, you know, I don't know, those of you who might have gone on to a Jewish high school, that's where you start learning him, you know, when you're in high school, at least for girls. I don't know if the boys get into it at all. That's the Ibn Ezra commentary. That is any Mikros Gedolos, you know, of the Tanakh. But I want to stress first, Rabbi Moshe ibn Ezra, apparently he was a great personality, you know, in his own right. He lived from the years 1070 to 1140. He was one of the most famous Jews of Spain at that time, and apparently, you know, it spanned the centuries. And again, I guess scholars of the time period, you know, would be aware of him and his writings. He was a contemporary both of that Rabbi, the Ibn Magash, and also Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I'll talk more about him in a little bit. You can tell by what happens to him during his life how conditions are now going to worsen, you know, for the Jews of Spain. And eventually, you know, how they will lead ultimately to their dispersal from Spain. And some of the same difficulties that he encountered will also be reflected in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's life. Again, they're contemporaries, all right? Okay, I told you his life was 1070 to 1140. He lived in a very, very difficult, a very turbulent time period. So this is going to be the period, you know, from the Almoravids going into the Almohad. I'm getting confused with their names because they're so similar. Almohads, right? And how is he going to react to it? He was born into a very wealthy, a very prominent Spanish Jewish family, but apparently got into a dispute with one of his brothers, Nebuch, and so he left. He was forced to leave his Granada, where he lived, and first he went to live in Portugal, and eventually he comes back to Spain, lives in Seville, and from there he went to Christian Spain, went to the north. And he found himself in problems there with whoever the local duke was. We don't know. We just, I guess it's written down in some source, you know, that his life was troubled there, but we don't know the reason why it happened or what dispute he had with this duke. So he's arrested and imprisoned. But because of his stature in the Jewish community, he was soon ransomed and released. Now, apparently he was married, he had children, but he was very poor. And he's gone from place to place. He has no permanent base at all. But apparently he had great Torah knowledge, and he also was a great poet. I'll learn a little bit more about that. And so he produced many, many famous poems from this time period. I actually own a book, a compilation of poetry from this time period, and he is one of those who was listed in there. Apparently he wrote Kinos, and they're very well known, and he also wrote a poetic eulogy for the Rif, right? The Rabbi Yehuda Alfasi, and it's actually it's inscribed on his tombstone. So Karen, I know that you had gone to Spain. Did they take you to cemeteries when you were there? Did you see tombstones at all, any place? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know you went to certain key cities, but so I don't know if you can actually go there and I don't know if these Jewish cemeteries still exist. That's more my question. I was curious about that. So I'd have to do more research, you know, to figure that out. So again, I told you he was a great poet. Besides being obviously a rabbinic scholar, he's also a great poet. And in addition to these keynotes that he wrote, he also wrote slichos, but not the ones that we would say, those, you know, from the Ashkenazi world. They are in the Sephardic liturgy. for the Yomim Noraim. So I guess if you ever daven in a Sephardic minyan, you look, what slichos you're saying, you would see his name mentioned. Apparently he's also a philosopher, and of course we know because of his skills in poetry, he was a great linguist, and so he was well known for his knowledge of the Hebrew language. Later years, he composed something called Shirat Yisrael, and that apparently it was a treatise when he talked about the historic development of Jewish poetry in Spain. Remember, this is a tradition that's going back several hundred years. And in this book that he wrote, this Shirat Yisrael, he analyzed the different styles and meters. A lot of them are based on a Spanish Arabic, form of poetry, all right? But he's putting it now that this is a book on Hebrew poetry. And then he gave, within that, explaining the meter, whatever, how they're writing their verses. He also had a critical assessment of all the various poets and their works, in this book. He was also, I told you, a distinguished Talmudist. He wrote on halachic matters, and apparently response to Shelot and Teshuvot also came his way, and he would have responded. Okay. Apparently he also wrote a philosophic treatise. Remember, it's interesting, the two key types of writings, I mean, not to say obviously they were studied the Talmud, and here and there they wrote commentaries, but they're known as poets and philosophers because those were the key disciplines in Muslim Spain. So he wrote this treatise discussing Hashem's relationship to the universe, man, and the Jewish people. Okay, he was so well known. Apparently, Christian and Muslim scholars often would consult him in matters of philosophy. So we think we're going to study a little while later on, the Rambam, so you can see his bent. It's already a well-established phenomenon for the Jews of the Sephardic Muslims, as far as the Sephardic Jews, to study philosophy. Not so much in the north and the Jews of Ashkenaz, although there are some works of philosophy, but a different slant, a different angle than the ones that the Jews in Spain wrote. He often actually apparently just engaged in debate with some of these, non-Jewish the Muslim scholars, and he always defended, of course, the beliefs of Judaism against whatever critical works they might have said. And he's the prototype of the Sephardic scholars of the Golden Age. Okay, now the next person you have all heard, I hope, and that's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Again, he is a contemporary of this Rabbi Moshe. Okay, and he lived from 1080 to 1145. So he's definitely going more into that 12th century. All right, let me just see. Okay, right. Similar, right? The other was from 1070 to 1140. This is 1080 to 1145. So he really died at the age of 65. But his output, his magnificent output, is well known. It's come down through the ages. So you could say the Moshe Ibn Ezra, when he was more like this intellectual slant, for the Sephardic Golden Age, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, you could say he was the soul of that age, again, because of the most magnificent poetry that he wrote. He was a colleague of this Ibn Megash. Remember, we started off discussing him, okay? And so he obviously studied Talmud, he is, a great scholar of Judaica, but he also became very friendly with this Moshe Ibn Ezra. And it's from this man, right? Remember, he wrote that book I told you about Hebrew poetry. He learned the art of language, poetry, and song, in addition, obviously, to works of philosophy. And in all of these, the younger students surpassed the older master. That's why we know his name a lot more, right, than Moshe Ibn Ezra. He's considered to be the poet laureate of Israel. and as well as, of course, the defender of the faith of the Torah and the tradition of Israel, because not only to his poetry, but I'll discuss in a little while, he wrote this book of Jewish philosophy called the Kuzari. All right, but first I'll talk more about his poetry. And he's also the inspired dreamer of the redemption of the Jewish people and their return to Zion, or Zion. And I'm sure you I hope you've heard this. It's like his famous, beautiful poetry, with talking about his longing for Israel. And it's called Libi Mizrach. My heart is in the east, Vanochi Besof Ma'arav, but I'm at the ends of the west. And we'll see how he does fulfill this longing at the end of his life. So very, very fast. I have to give credit to my son Yechiel in Detroit, because for the life of me, I knew the part Libi Mizrach. I couldn't remember the second part of the line of this poetry. So I called my son, and like that, he answered me. So I said to him, yes, he surpassed me in certain areas, because I used to always teach him that he would call me and ask me the questions. I said, now I can turn to him and get the answers. So for some things, I turn to my son Shalom as well, but for certain other things, I turn to my son Yechiel. By the way, I've asked Shalom, when we get closer to his time period in England, that he could, he'll be our guest lecturer, so that should be very nice. Then you'll see a bit younger person talking. Okay. Now it's interesting, because later on the Rambam will also choose this profession. Apparently, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was a physician, but he loved writing his poetry, teaching Torah, inspiring people with their faith. He apparently the Shabbos song that you sing, Yom Shabbos, right? That's his. He wrote that, and he also wrote a very famous Kina that we recite on Tisha B'Av. It's called Tzion Halot Tish'ali, right? And you can look those up should you want to. And just think of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right, living here in the 12th century Spain, Muslim Spain. And apparently, I told you he had a very close friendship with his colleague, this Rabbi Moshe Ibn Ezra. And Moshe Ibn Ezra, had only words of praise, for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And it's interesting, he has become the more famous of the two men. And apparently, he had been living in Toledo, and then he settled in Granada. All right. Then he came in contact with many other members of the nobility, and they admired his wisdom, his breadth of knowledge. It's interesting, I remember learning this. I can't remember if I was in high school or college, but I did learn the poetry of, I guess that's why I own that book, of the, these great Spanish Jewish poets. But when they started writing, obviously they eventually will write. The emphasis will be on Jewish modes of thought, but their earliest poetry was very secular. They'll talk about nature and other beautiful things that they're describing. So it's apparently Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in his later years, he sort of regretted that he actually had spent so much of his formative years writing that type of poetry, because after that, he definitely shifted to writing only things about, Israel or Jewish thought, whatever. Hundreds of his works, right, have survived to this very day. And his words of beauty, they express the innermost emotions and longings for Israel in exile, struggling to survive. Look, he himself was living now under this Almohad. It's a very difficult time period. And his hope that someday Israel will still prosper and fulfill her prophetic mission. Now I'm going to talk about his great contribution to Jewish philosophy, and that is the Kuzari. And I do remember studying this. Again, I can never remember whether it was high school or college. This was a fact. The Khazars were an actual kingdom, part of near Russia, near the Black Sea, who actually converted to Judaism in the 7th century. So that's an actual fact. He's now going to write this book, the Kuzari, and imagining what it was, what led the king of the Khazars to convert to Judaism. So what he does, he imagines that the three representatives of the great monotheistic religions of that time period, which still are to this day, would be obviously those representatives of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. They would all appear before the king of the Khazars and his court, and try to explain, why their religion is the superior one, and then eventually, obviously, the king will then decide which one he thinks is the most authentic, and he will then choose one of them as a religion for his entire country. But in this, obviously, he's going to emphasize, obviously, the Jewish aspect of it, and so we learn so much of a way of thinking about Judaism, in these philosophic terms. And eventually, based on the reasonings, given by the Jewish representative, the king, the Khazar king, decides, that, this is truly the most authentic of the three monotheistic religions, and that he has his entire kingdom convert to it. So apparently, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi based most of his arguments on tradition, of course, history, world events, and just his own intuitive human knowledge and sensitivity. Apparently, it includes discussions on the oral tradition, reward and punishment, a refutation of the Karaite heresy that's just still existing in this time period, and even astronomy. And we talk about the Karaites when we come to the Rambam. He was written originally in Arabic. You find out a lot of the works that come out from this time period are in Arabic. They're only later translated into Hebrew. Eventually, though, the Kuzarites also translated into Hebrew. That was the volume I had studied. And eventually, obviously, into other languages, and then it would have been spread to other Jewish communities. Now, in the year 1138, there was, again, a Muslim persecution of the Jewish community. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi fled southern Spain, and he found refuge in the Christian north, which, again, seems so ironic in light of what's going to happen to northern Christian Spain and how they're going to treat their Jews. But this time it is safe and secure for them to go northward. Apparently he lived in several different places there, but in the year 1141, he decided to leave for Eretz Yisrael. Now, some of what I'm going to tell you, some of it's fact, but some of it is just conjecture. Okay. On board the ship, apparently, that took him to Alexandria, Egypt, he wrote a series of poems, and they're called Shirei Hayam. And there he expresses his faith in God, his longing for Zion, and his wonder at the beauty and the terror of the sea. So obviously it has come down to us. In Alexandria, he was warmly welcomed by the local Jewish community. I guess he must have left a copy of these writings of his poetry in Alexandria, and that's why we have it. And the leaders of Alexandria, they're very impressed by him, his scholarship. He was already a very famous poet and well-known. Perhaps they knew of also the publication of the book, The Kuzari, and they actually welcomed him to stay and settle there and become a prominent member of the Alexandrian Jewish community. But he stayed in Egypt only a short while, and then he boarded a ship heading for Jaffa, because he, how we have this great yearning to be in Zion, to be in Israel. Now, this is a tradition. I can picture this. I don't know where I see a painting or something, that he finally reaches Yerushalayim. All right. And he falls to the ground, he's in this great state of ecstasy. And then an Arab horseman drives by, with like a scythe, a knife in his hand. And as, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is bending down and kissing, the picture I have, I think, is have some near the kotel that this is happening. Whatever. And he rides by him and he, kills him. The other thing is that he trampled him with his horse. Whatever, he lost his life. We don't know 100%, what happened to him, but he did die, and obviously in pretty tragic circumstances when he had finally reached his destination, this great yearning he had for all these many, many years, and he lost his life there. Now I want to talk to you about the great Ibn Ezra, who is the commentator, the Foresh on Chumash, that we study. And that's Rabbi Avraham, as opposed to Moshe. Ibn Ezra, apparently they might have been like cousins of some sort. He lived in the years 1089 into the year 1164. So you see, they all lived around that same time period. He was born in Toledo, but then he was raised, Toledo's to the north, more central Spain, and then he moved further south to Cordova. And there he studied under the disciples of Ibn Magash. I guess Ibn Magash had passed away at that point, but that's who he learned under, his disciples. Apparently, he too was a precocious child. I guess they had to be pretty brilliant, even in their childhood, these people, to rise and to become such prominent people, later in their lives. And he soon matured. He was not only a Torah scholar, but he was also expert in the arts and sciences. Despite his extraordinary capabilities, he never succeeded, though, in his various financial ventures. Seems like a lot of Rabbanim were poor, right? They might have had their smarts in certain areas, but financially, they didn't seem to know how to make a decent income. And he lived most of his life in poverty. He, again, was a very great friend of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and apparently he often quotes him. I don't remember this. I mean, I did remember studying Ibn Ezra, but it's been many years. And apparently he actually quotes Yehuda Halevi in his commentary to the Torah. Yeah, unfortunately, he also had a sad married life. His wife died when she was quite young, and she left him with just a sole surviving son. Apparently, he had other children who had been born to him, but they all died in their infancy. Now, during the Almoravid, again, the Almoravids come before the Almohads, right? In the year 1135, this is Rabbi Abraham went into exile with his brothers. And after a very difficult journey, he's really leaving Spain. He goes to Rome. He's going to spend several years living in Italy. Apparently there he started composing his commentary to the Torah, or it's the Tanakh, but he starts with the book of Kohelet, which Shlomo HaMelech wrote. So for 4 years, he lives there from place to place in Italy. Couldn't seem to settle down. But he devoted himself, obviously, to his commentary on the Chumash or whole Tanakh, and would go from sefer to sefer, working on it. Now, this is it's like almost an aside, but just to tell you how tragic some of their lives were. So I told you he had this one surviving son. Right? But apparently, this child's name was Yitzchak. He left for Baghdad. I don't know what, trying to do something with his life. But while there, he converted to Islam. Remember now, this is that entire area, talking about Iraq and Iran. They're all Muslim at this time period. Eventually, apparently, though, he repented and returns to Judaism. His father doesn't know anything about all this. Apparently, though, later he composed a poem in which he tried to vindicate himself, that really he had never transgressed the laws of the Torah. And soon after that, apparently, he died. Well, then Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra eventually finds out about this, apparently 3 years after the son's death. And he was, you can imagine, he was just struck with this unbelievable grief. And apparently from that time on, he just could not seem to find himself. He never settled in any permanent home after, just constantly on the move. Apparently from Italy, he travels then to Provence, that's southern France, and then eventually goes to northern France. And then wherever he goes, he's become quite a great scholar, a man of renown, and he's always well received and honored. But he just couldn't seem to find himself. Apparently, while he was in northern France, he met Rabbeinu Tam. Right, we learned about him. He was one of the foremost of the Balei Tosfos in France, and again received honor from him and accolades. But in the year 1148, I think it's so interesting, he traveled to London. I think it's amazing, 1158. And apparently while there, he also continued his halachic writings. But then by the year 1160, he goes back again to Provence, and he died several years later, and we do not know where he is buried. So it's very sad, although we have his commentary, and he's been studied now for hundreds of years. So he lives on, through his works. Again, he's most famous for his commentary on Tanakh, although he also apparently was a poet. He knew philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, Hebrew language, grammar, and all these things, will be are evident, in his commentary. And it's now, again, I told you, it's part and parcel of a printed version of Mikraos Gedolos. Now, he had very original, unique approach to certain biblical problems and textual difficulties. And so his work is considered to be very innovative. It's challenging. It's a little unusual. I have to tell you, if you ever study the Ramban, now he's not going to come till the 13th century. Boy, he did not like Ibn Ezra at all. And he often begins his own commentary. He disagrees very vehemently with Ibn Ezra's approach, right? And apparently, I guess his work was somewhat controversial. Obviously, the Ramban for sure didn't like it. He liked the Peshat. He liked it when you want to study Chumash, like Rashi's a lot's drash, all right? A lot of it's based on the Medrash and Agada. He said just study simple Peshat, and from that we can understand what's going on. Of course, if anything, he brought down any proofs, from the Talmud. Obviously he was certainly respectful of that, but his key thing was focusing on the Peshat. And apparently, through his understanding of human nature, this helped him to understand then what was actually going on in the actual text. He also attacked the Karaite communities. I told you they're going to be around for a little while. And apparently they had written commentaries, so he attacked those ones. But apparently his work became ultimately very popular. And apparently a lot of super commentaries, we're talking about people before him who lived afterwards, comment on his work. It's highly respected. Ramban didn't like him. Other people have and do respect his writings. And so he had a very sad personal life, but look at his great contribution to Jewish scholarship. And as I say, also anyone who studies Tanakh will study. First and foremost is always Rashi. There's no question. I mean, he gives the most wonderful explanations. And then you would study people like Ibn Ezra and Ramban. Ramban also will I think surpass him. But Ibn Ezra holds his own weight. I told you the fact that they determined when they were printing, a printed version of Tanakh, Ibn Ezra is included there in that Mikraos Gedolos. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Almohads. Remember, first we have the Almoravids. They're the ones who initially come up with the wonderful idea, well, either convert or go into exile. But they took the bribes and they sort of overlooked things. All right. But the Almohads, boy, they're not interested. They're not going to take any bribes. They're like these very pure Muslims. All right. So I'll tell you a little bit more about them, and then we'll progress in Jewish history. How are we doing? Oh my gosh. Should I stop here? We'll just start with the what? I should go on a little bit. Oh, I'll go on a little bit. All right. It says the constant instability of the Muslim world with all these different interpretations of Islam, intrigues with different tribes, and also being competitive now with the Christian world. And eventually, obviously, all these internecine struggles are going to spill over and affect the Jews as well. So the Almohads, they was also coming up out of North Africa from Morocco. They were fanatical Moorish tribesmen, and they overtook Muslim Spain, as we learned, in the year 1149. Now they view themselves, makes me think of ISIS, that they are the saviors of Islam from the corrupt rule of the Almoravids. Those who thought it was okay to be pagan and a sufficiently large prize, so we'll overlook some of the ways you act. No, everything's above board with them. Either you do it our way or no way is acceptable. They violently wrested rule from the Almoravids, and they began to set about a pure and correct Islamic society. These things just repeat themselves every so often, as you go through history. Their rigid religious attitude made them immune to the bribes, what I mentioned, which had corrupted the Almoravids. And as a result, so during Almoravid rule, maybe initially things were bad, but eventually the Jews, had some sort of modicum of safety, and they could continue living their Jewish lives. I guess that's why some of the people I've already mentioned to you were able to flourish, living, in Muslim Spain. but this was a like a fundamentalist. It was very fanatic. It was very intolerant society, and all the words of the Quran had to be enforced literally, and there was no room anymore. But we're going to come now closer to the very end of that golden age. So the actual policy, it actually was stated, I guess, of the Almohads towards the Jews under the control. They actually terrorized them, and they ultimately offered them also, but they really meant it. You had the choice: either you convert to Islam or choose exile. So I want to stop here, okay, because then I have more to say about them, and then eventually we will start learning then about the Rambam, who came from Spain and lived in this area until obviously he left. So we'll do more next week. Hope all is good with everybody. People stay safe, right, healthy, please God. Whenever we can get that shot